A man shattered by humiliation and isolation, Lars Hertervig rebuilt himself through visionary inner landscapes that transformed suffering into light, revealing the soul's journey from rupture to renewal. Today's theme is Landscapes of the Soul, Hertervig, Jung, and the Art of Inner Transformation. Chapter 1. Introduction. Welcome back, Thor, to our podcast. Thor, in your last video you talked about Düsseldorf as both the birthplace of Hertervig's artistic voice and the site of his emotional collapse. Today, I want to move into the next chapter, Gaustad. Many people still think of this period as the end of his artistic life, but you argue the opposite.
Yes, absolutely. Gaustad wasn't the end. It was a rupture, but also a turning point. The Norwegian Biographical Encyclopedia describes how he was admitted in 1856 with melancholia, later reclassified as dementia, a term that at the time covered what we might now associate with schizophrenia. He was discharged in 1858 as not cured and legally incapacitated. That's a devastating label for anyone, let alone someone as sensitive as Hertervig.
So he leaves Gaustad stripped of autonomy, cut off from the art world, and dependent on the poor relief system in Stavanger. How does someone recover from that?
That's the remarkable part. He doesn't recover back to who he was. He transforms. The years after Gaustad are often portrayed as decline, but when I look closely, they're the beginning of something radically new. He starts working with improvised materials, cheap paper, homemade pigments, and instead of limiting him, these constraints open a new artistic language.
A language that looks nothing like the Düsseldorf school.
Exactly. The academic landscape tradition falls away. What emerges is something visionary, almost ethereal. Transparent washes of light. Forests that feel psychological rather than botanical. Water that behaves like memory. These works are not topographical landscapes, they're inner landscapes.
And this is where your interpretation becomes so compelling. You connect this shift to the emotional trauma he experienced, not as pathology, but as creative reorientation.
Yes. We know from the sources that he once said his melancholy came from staring observation of the landscape in sunlight. That line tells us everything. Nature wasn't scenery for him, it was an encounter. After Gaustad, that encounter becomes even more intense. He paints not what he sees, but what the landscape does to him.
So, the crisis doesn't silence him, it strips away everything that isn't essential.
Precisely. The humiliation, the institutionalization, the loss of status, all that isolates him socially, but it also frees him artistically. He no longer paints for the academy, or for patrons, or for recognition. He paints because it's the only language he has left. And in that space, he becomes a modernist before modernism.
That's a bold claim, placing him alongside Van Gogh, Gauguin, even Munch.
It is bold, but it's also supported by newer research. His works from the 1860s and 70s are not symptoms of illness. They're expressions of a deep human experience, vulnerability, insight, and creative resilience. He turns psychological rupture into artistic innovation.
So, Gaustad wasn't the end of Hertervig's art. It was the beginning of his most original voice.
Exactly. Through suffering and isolation, he found a new visual language, one shaped by light, memory, and the inner world. And that's why his paintings still move us today. They're not just landscapes. They're survival.
Chapter 2. Hertervig after Gaustad, the Inner Reawakening. Or, in the last part of our conversation, you described how Hertervig's years after Gaustad weren't a collapse, but a kind of inner reorientation. I want to go deeper into that. What exactly do you think happened inside him during those silent years?
What my study shows is that the years from 1858 to 1865 weren't artistic emptiness. They were psychological reconstruction. As the text puts it, he entered an inner reorientation, a reckoning with everything that had shaped him both psychologically and socially. He had to dismantle the damage done in Düsseldorf, the humiliation, the gaslighting, the triangulation, before he could paint again with any authenticity.
You've used terms like gaslighting, narcissistic supply, triangulation, concepts from modern psychology. How do these concepts help us understand Hertervig?
They give us a vocabulary for what he lived through. My research details how he was subjected to ridicule, deception, and social exclusion, a kind of gaslighting where he gradually began to doubt his own experiences and self-worth. That's exactly what Dr. Ramani Durvasula talks about, how narcissistic manipulation destabilizes a person's sense of reality. Hertervig wasn't just fragile, he was systematically undermined.
And that makes his withdrawal after Gaustad look very different.
Exactly. Instead of seeing it as stagnation, we can see it as self-protection. Jung would call it individuation, a descent into the inner world to rebuild the self. Dr. Ramani would call it radical boundary setting. Hertervig had to go no contact long before the term existed. He cut ties with the people and environments that had harmed him.
Your study even compares his inner work to a kind of trance, a self-guided healing process.
Yes, and that's one of the most fascinating parts. The text says he entered a hypnotic trance, a meditative state where he could process and remove the psychological burdens that had been placed on him. He didn't have therapy, but he had art. He used painting to cleanse the psyche, to remove what didn't belong to him.
And is this where the transformation begins?
Absolutely. Once he had stripped away the psychological debris, he could paint again, but now with a completely new voice. My research describes how he created visionary landscapes, mental spaces where light, forest, and water took on symbolic and psychological meaning. These weren't academic landscapes anymore. They were inner maps.
It's striking how often light appears in descriptions of his later work.
Light becomes his language. After 1865, he paints landscapes that feel illuminated from within. Works like Gamle, furutrær, and Skogtjern aren't just scenes, they're states of being. The study says it beautifully. These paintings are visual diaries, testimonies of an inner journey through suffering, insight, and creative power.
So, the isolation wasn't a prison, it was a studio.
Exactly. A psychological studio, a place where he could confront the shadow, as Jung would say, and turn it into form. He wasn't painting for the market. He wasn't painting for approval. He was painting to survive and to understand.
And that's why his work feels so modern today.
Yes, because it's not national romanticism. It's not academic. It's existential. It's the same territory as Van Gogh, Munch, and Rothko later explored, the inner landscape. My research even notes that he should be seen on the same level as artists like Vincent van Gogh, Paul Gauguin, and Edvard Munch. He was ahead of time.
Or, if you had to summarize what makes Hertervig's post-Gaustad art so powerful, what would you say?
I'd say this. He took the darkest experiences of his life, humiliation, isolation, psychological manipulation, and transformed them into light. Not metaphorically, but literally. His landscapes glow because he rebuilt himself through them. They are the record of a man who walked through the inner night and came back with visions.
That's a profound way to see him. And it gives his paintings a depth that goes far beyond technique.
Exactly. They're not just beautiful, they're brave.
Chapter 3. Hertervig and the Heyoka Energy in a Norwegian Landscape. Thor, everything you've described so far, the isolation, the inner reconstruction, the visionary shift in his art almost sounds like Hertervig was undergoing a kind of spiritual transformation, not just a psychological one.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it leads us naturally into something I've been thinking about for a long time. The idea of Hertervig as a kind of Nordic Heyoka. The study hints at this when it says his paintings are infused with a kind of Heyoka energy, quiet yet powerful, vulnerable yet visionary. This duality is essential.
For viewers who may not know the term, what is a Heyoka?
In the Lakota tradition, a Heyoka is the sacred clown, the one who heals through inversion, mirroring, and paradox. They walk backwards, speak opposites, laugh when others cry, not to mock, but to reveal. Their purpose is to disrupt rigid patterns so people can see themselves more clearly. They heal by unsettling, by showing the world from the other side.
And you see that in Hertervig?
Absolutely. Think about it. After the trauma of Düsseldorf and the institutional erasure at Gaustad, he returns to Stavanger stripped of everything: status, autonomy, belonging. But instead of collapsing, he begins to paint landscapes that turn the world inside out. He paints nature not as it looks, but as it feels. He paints light that behaves like memory, trees that stand like wounded guardians, water that reflects the psyche. His landscapes are mirrors, but not polite ones. They show us what we don't usually see.
So, the Heyoka energy is not about humor, but about inversion?
Exactly. A Heyoka reveals truth by reversing expectations. And that's what Hertervig does. His landscapes are familiar, yet deeply strange. They unsettle gently. They whisper instead of shouting. They invite us to look again, and then deeper. The study describes this beautifully. He didn't paint to impress, but to reflect. And in that reflection, the observer could see both nature and themselves anew. That is pure Heyoka.
It's fascinating to think of a Norwegian landscape painter in dialogue with an indigenous North American archetype.
And yet it fits. The Heyoka is not a cultural label, it's an energetic pattern. It's the person who heals by turning the world slightly sideways. Hertervig's life was marked by pain, manipulation, and exclusion. But instead of reproducing the darkness, he transformed it into a kind of luminous inversion. He took the chaos inside him and made it into clarity for others.
And his materials, the cheap paper, the homemade pigments, almost reinforce that inversion.
Exactly. He takes what is low status and turns it into something transcendent. He takes scarcity and makes it visionary. He takes marginalization and turns it into originality. That's Heyoka medicine, healing through reversal.
So, when we look at Skogtjern or Gamle furutrær, we're not just seeing landscapes, we're seeing a kind of spiritual mirror.
Yes, these works are invitations. They ask, what do you see when the world is stripped of convention? What do you see when the landscape becomes a reflection of your own inner weather? Heyoka asks, are you willing to see what you've avoided? Hertervig asks the same, but through light, through silence, through the trembling of trees.
And perhaps that's why his art feels so contemporary. It speaks to people who are navigating their own inner landscapes.
Exactly. Hertervig's paintings are not about Norway. They're about consciousness. They're about the moment when suffering becomes insight, when inversion becomes clarity, when the wound becomes a window. He is, in many ways, the quiet Heyoka of Norwegian art, the one who healed by painting the world backwards so we could finally see it forwards.
Chapter 4. How Hertervig's shadow work appears in specific paintings. We've talked about Hertervig's inner landscapes in a general sense: the forests, the light, the emotional atmosphere. But I'd love to go deeper into specific work. Where do you see his shadow work most clearly?
There are three paintings where his psychological journey becomes almost transparent: Gamle furutrær, 1865, Skogtjern, and Fra Tysvær. Each one reveals a different stage of his confrontation with the shadow and his gradual integration of it.
Let's start with Gamle furutrær, the confrontation. It's often described as the beginning of his visionary period.
Yes, and for good reason. This painting is Hertervig's first major step into the forest of the unconscious. The trees stand like ancient guardians, twisted, wounded, yet dignified. They're not decorative. They're psychological figures. Jung would say they represent the archetype of the wounded self, the part of us that carries memory, trauma, and resilience.
The trees almost look like characters.
Exactly. They lean, they bend, they endure. They're scared, but still standing. That's Hertervig's shadow work made visible. He's painting the part of himself that survived Düsseldorf, Gaustad, and the years of humiliation. The landscape becomes a portrait of endurance.
And Skogtjern, the descent into the unconscious? That painting feels different, quieter, more introspective.
Skogtjern is the descent. The forest closes in, the water becomes a mirror, and the light is diffused, almost hesitant. This is the moment Jung describes as entering the shadow, the willingness to face what is hidden. My research captures this beautifully when it calls these works inner states, spiritual spaces, and existential reflections.
The water is fascinating. It's calm, but not peaceful.
Yes, it's reflective but not comforting. Water in Jungian symbolism is unconscious. In Skogtjern, the water doesn't show a clear reflection. It shows depth. It shows uncertainty. It shows the unknown. This is Hertervig looking inward without flinching.
And then we have Fra Tysvær, the integration, which feels more open, more luminous.
Exactly. This is the integration phase, the moment when the shadow has been acknowledged and transformed. The landscape is still emotionally charged, but the light is stronger, more coherent. The composition breathes. It's as if he's saying, I have walked through the forest. I have seen what needed to be seen. And now I can return home, not as who I was, but as who I've become.
So, Fra Tysvær is not nostalgia, it's resolution.
Yes, it's the return from the underworld. Jung would call it individuation, the moment when the self becomes whole. Hertervig paints his home landscape not as memory, but as insight. The light is no longer fragile. It's earned.
When you lay them out like this, the thread connecting them as confrontation, descent, integration, it becomes almost like a psychological trilogy.
That's exactly how I see it. These paintings are not separate works. They're chapters of an inner journey. Hertervig didn't just paint landscapes. He painted the stages of healing. Gamle furutrær, meeting the wound. Skogtjern, entering the shadow. Fra Tysvær, returning with the light. This is why his art feels so alive today. It's not just beautiful, it's archetypal. It speaks to anyone who has walked through darkness and come out changed.
And that makes Hertervig not just a painter of nature, but a painter of transformation.
Exactly. His landscapes are not places, they're processes. They show us what it looks like when a human being turns suffering into vision.
Chapter 5. Hertervig's inner landscapes and Jung's shadow work. Thor, the way you describe Hertervig as a kind of Nordic Heoka, someone who heals by mirroring, by inversion, by showing us what we don't want to see, it reminds me of something else. There's a strong resonance with Carl Jung's idea of the shadow. Do you see this connection?
Very much so. In fact, once you start looking at Hertervig through that lens, the entire arc of his life and art becomes a kind of Jungian case study. Jung believed that every human being carries a shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress, deny, or simply cannot face. And he argued that true healing comes from turning toward that shadow, not away from it. Hertervig did exactly that. His inner landscapes are not escapes from reality, they are confrontations with it.
How do you see that confrontation in the paintings themselves?
Look at the works from after 1865, Skogtjern, Gamle furutrær, Fra Tysvær. They're not idyllic. They're not decorative. They're landscapes filled with tension, ambiguity, and emotional weather. They are psychological terrains. My research describes them as inner states, spiritual spaces, and existential reflections, a phrase that captures exactly what Jung meant by shadow work, entering the inner forest and meeting what lives there.
So, does the forest becomes a metaphor for the unconscious?
Exactly. Jung often used the forest as a symbol for the unknown self, the place where the ego dissolves and deeper truths emerge. Hertervig's forests are not places you stroll through. They're places you descend into. They're dense, luminous, unsettling. They hold both danger and revelation. And that duality, light and shadow intertwined, is the essence of Jung's psychology.
And the light in his paintings? It's so distinctive, almost otherworldly.
That light is crucial. Jung said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Hertervig's light is not decorative. It's earned. It breaks through the trees like insight breaking through confusion. It's the light that comes after the descent, not instead of it. His landscapes show us what it looks like when someone has walked through their own shadow and come out with a new vision.
And this connects back to the Heyoka idea, the healing through inversion.
Yes, Heyoka turns the world upside down so we can see it clearly. Jung asks us to turn inward so we can see ourselves clearly. Hertervig does both. He paints landscapes that invert the expected, forests that feel like dreams, water that behaves like memory, light that seems to come from inside the earth. He is showing us the world backwards so we can finally see it forwards.
And perhaps that's why his art feels so intimate. It's not just nature, it's a psyche.
Exactly. Jung would say that Hertervig externalized his inner world. He projected the unconscious onto the landscape, not as pathology, but as revelation. His paintings are not symptoms, they're integrations. They show a man who has met his shadow, survived it, and woven it into his art.
So, when we look at a Hertervig landscape, we're not just seeing trees and water, we're seeing the process of individuation.
Yes, we're seeing a human being becoming whole. We're seeing the moment when suffering becomes insight, when chaos becomes form, when the shadow becomes light. That's why his paintings still move us. They're not just beautiful, they're brave. They show us what it looks like to walk into the inner forest and return with a vision.
And that makes Hertervig not just a painter of landscapes, but a painter of consciousness.
Precisely. He painted the terrain of the soul.
Chapter 6. Hertwig, Munch, Rothko, Painters of the Shadow. 4. The way you describe Hertervig's inner landscapes, as psychological terrain shaped by shadow, light, and emotional weather, makes me think of other artists who painted from the inside out. I'm thinking of Munch, of course, but also Rothko. Do you see Hertervig as part of that lineage?
Absolutely. In fact, when you place Hertervig next to Munch and Rothko, something fascinating emerges. All three are painters of the shadow, but each approach it differently. Hertervig externalizes the shadow into nature. Munch dramatizes it through the human figure. Rothko dissolves it into pure color and atmosphere. But the underlying impulse is the same, to make the invisible visible.
Let's start with Munch. How does Hertervig relate to him?
Munch is the more obvious comparison because he explicitly painted psychological states, anxiety, jealousy, despair, longing. But where Munch uses the human body as the stage, Hertervig uses the landscape. His forests, lakes, and cliffs carry the same emotional charge as Munch's figures. They tremble, they brood, they glow. My research describes Hertervig's works as inner states, spiritual spaces, and existential reflections. And that's exactly what Munch was after too, just through a different visual language.
So Hertervig is like a pre-Munch, but with nature as the protagonist?
Exactly. If Munch painted the scream of the psyche, Hertervig painted the whisper. Munch externalizes the crisis. Hertervig internalizes it. Munch confronts you. Hertervig invites you. But both are mapping the same territory, the shadow.
And Rothko? That's a more surprising comparison.
It is, but it's also incredibly revealing. Rothko once said that he wasn't interested in color, but in basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom. His paintings are fields of feeling. They're not landscapes, but they function like inner landscapes. Hertervig does something similar. His light is not literal, it's emotional. His compositions are not descriptive, they're meditative. Rothko creates a space where the viewer meets themselves. Hertervig does the same, but through trees, water, and sky. Both artists paint the threshold between the conscious and the unconscious.
So, all three of them, Hertervig, Munch, Rothko, are engaged in shadow work, but each in their own way?
Exactly. Think of it like this. Hertervig enters the shadow through nature. Munch enters the shadow through the human condition. Rothko enters the shadow through abstraction and atmosphere. But the psychological movement is identical. a descent into the inner world, a confrontation with what is hidden, and a return with a new language.
And Hertervig's language is the most subtle of the three.
Yes, and that's what makes him so extraordinary. His shadow work is quiet, almost whispered. He doesn't scream like Munch or engulf you like Rothko. He guides you gently into the forest of your own psyche. He shows you the shadow not as a threat, but as a landscape, something you can walk through, breathe in, and eventually understand.
That's a powerful way to see him. It elevates his work beyond national romanticism or biographical tragedy.
Exactly. Hertervig isn't just a Norwegian landscape painter. He's part of a global lineage of artists who turned inward, who used art to navigate trauma, identity, and the unconscious. He belongs in the same conversation as Munch and Rothko because he, too, painted the human condition from the inside out.
And perhaps that's why his paintings still feel so alive. They're not just images, they're invitations.
Yes. Invitations to enter our own shadow, to see what we've avoided, and to find the light that waits on the other side.
Chapter 7: Hertervig and Van Gogh, Artists Who Transmuted Trauma into Vision. We've explored how Hertervig's inner landscapes reflect shadow work and psychological integration. But there's another artist people often bring up when discussing trauma-driven creativity: Vincent van Gogh. Do you see a meaningful connection between the two?
Absolutely. And it's a connection that becomes more striking the deeper you look. Hertervig and Van Gogh never met, never knew of each other, and worked in different artistic traditions. Yet both transformed psychological suffering into a new visual language. Both painted not what the eye sees, but what the soul endures.
What would you say is the core similarity between them?
Both men used art as a form of survival. Not expression, survival. Van Gogh painted to stay alive, to hold himself together. Hertervig painted to rebuild himself after being psychologically dismantled. Their works are not decorative, they're existential. They're attempts to make sense of inner chaos.
And yet their styles are so different.
Yes, but the impulse behind the style is the same. Van Gogh externalizes emotion through violent brushstrokes, intense color, and swirling movement. Hertervig does the opposite. He internalizes emotion through quiet light, trembling trees, and translucent atmospheres. Van Gogh screams. Hertervig whispers. But both are speaking from the same wound.
Trauma as catalyst, both artists experienced profound psychological distress. How did that shape their work?
For Van Gogh, the trauma was constant: loneliness, rejection, poverty, and a mind that never rested. For Hertervig, the trauma was relational: humiliation, gaslighting, institutionalization. My research describes how he was subjected to narcissistic manipulation and how this undermined his identity. Both men were broken open by life, and art became the vessel that held the pieces.
The inner landscape, you've said before that Hertervig painted the psyche through nature. Van Gogh did something similar, didn't he?
Yes, but in different registers. Van Gogh's wheat fields, cypresses, and starry skies are emotional storms. They pulse with agitation, longing, and spiritual hunger. Herdervig's forests and lakes are emotional mirrors, still, luminous, unsettling. Van Gogh paints the explosion of the inner world. Herdervig paints the echo. Both reveal the psyche, but from opposite ends of the spectrum.
Light is revelation. Light plays a huge role in both artists' work.
Exactly. For Van Gogh, light is ecstatic, a force that breaks through darkness with almost manic intensity. For Herdervig, light is contemplative, a quiet revelation that emerges after long silence. Van Gogh's light is fire. Herdervig's light is breath. But both use light as a symbol of insight, the moment when suffering becomes understanding.
Isolation is studio. Both men lived in isolation. Do you think that shaped their creativity?
Without question. Van Gogh's isolation in Arles and Saint Remy forced him inward. Herdervig's isolation in Stavanger, after being declared not cured and cut off from the art world, did the same. My research describes his post-Gaustad years as a period of an inner reorientation. Isolation didn't destroy them, it distilled them.
Their new visual language born from pain. So, both artists turned trauma into innovation?
Exactly. Van Gogh revolutionized color and movement. Hertervig revolutionized atmosphere and psychological landscape. Both created something the world had never seen before, not because they wanted to innovate, but because they had no other way to survive. Their art is not a style, it's a necessity.
When you put it like that, it feels as if they were walking parallel paths, different landscapes, same journey.
That's precisely it. Van Gogh walked through fire. Hertervig walked through fog. But both emerged with visions that continue to move us because they speak to something universal, the human capacity to transform suffering into meaning. They didn't paint their pain. They painted what pain taught them. And that's why their work still resonates, because it's not about illness. It's about resilience.
Chapter 8. Hertervig and Rothko, Painters of Spiritual Atmosphere. Thor, earlier you drew a powerful comparison between Hertervig and Van Gogh as artists who transformed trauma into vision. But there's another artist whose work feels strangely connected to Hertervig's, Mark Rothko. Both seem to paint atmosphere rather than objects. How do you see the relationship between them?
It's a fascinating comparison because, on the surface, they couldn't be more different. Hertervig paints forests, lakes, cliffs, recognizable landscapes. Rothko paints floating fields of color. But if you step back from the literal imagery and look at what they're doing, the connection becomes unmistakable. Both artists paint states of consciousness. Both paint thresholds. Both paint the atmosphere of the soul.
That's beautifully put. What do you mean by thresholds?
A threshold is a space between worlds, between the visible and the invisible, the conscious and the unconscious. Rothko's paintings are pure thresholds, color fields that feel like portals, vibrating with emotion. Hertervig's landscapes are thresholds too, but expressed through nature, shimmering light, trembling trees, water that seems to breathe. Both artists create spaces where the viewer feels suspended, not in the physical world, but in an inner one.
Atmosphere is emotion. Rothko famously said he wasn't interested in color, but in emotion. Does that apply to Hertervig as well?
Absolutely. Rothko used color the way composers use sound, to evoke states of being. His reds, blues, and ochres are emotional climates. Hertervig does the same with light. His landscapes are not meteorological, they're psychological. The mist, the glow, the translucence, these are emotional atmospheres. Rothko paints the temperature of the soul. Hertervig paints its weather,
That's a striking distinction.
and yet both lead to the same place. A contemplative, almost meditative encounter with oneself.
Silence as language. Both artists' works feel incredibly quiet.
Yes, silence is their shared medium. Rothko's canvases don't shout, they hum. They create a stillness that pulls you inward. Hertervig's landscapes do the same. They're not dramatic. They're whispering. They invite you to listen to what's beneath the surface. This is why both artists are often described as spiritual, not in a religious sense, but in the sense of creating spaces where the viewer meets themselves.
Trauma as the hidden engine, and both had difficult lives.
Exactly. Rothko struggled with depression, displacement, and existential despair. Hertervig endured humiliation, gaslighting, institutionalization, and social isolation. Their suffering didn't define their art, but it deepened it. Both men painted not to escape pain, but to transform it. Rothko dissolves the world into color to reveal the emotional truth beneath it. Hertervig dissolves the world into atmosphere to reveal the psychological truth within it.
The viewer as participant. One thing that stands out with Rothko is how his paintings seem to change depending on who's looking at them. Does Hertervig have that quality too?
Very much so. Rothko's paintings are mirrors. They reflect the viewer's emotional state. Hertervig's landscapes do the same. They're not fixed narratives. They're invitations. The light in Skogtjern or Fra Tysvær shifts depending on your own inner weather. Both artists create participatory spaces. The painting is not complete until the viewer steps into it.
The spiritual dimension, so would you say both artists are, in their own way, mystic?
Yes, quiet mystics. Rothko through abstraction, Hertervig through nature. Both dissolve the boundary between the outer world and the inner one. Both create paintings that feel like meditation. Both offer a kind of spiritual atmosphere, a place where the viewer can breathe differently, think differently, feel differently. Hertervig's light is contemplative. Rothko's color is transcendent. Both lead us inward.
The deeper connection, when you describe them like this, it feels as if they're speaking the same language, just with different alphabets.
Exactly. Hertervig uses trees, water, and sky. Rothko uses color, vibration, and space. But both are painting the same thing, the invisible architecture of the human soul. They show us that art is not about representation, it's about revelation.
And that makes Hertervig feel far more modern than his time.
Yes. He belongs not only to Norwegian art history, but to the global lineage of artists who paint the inner world, alongside Rothko, alongside Munch, alongside Turner. He is a painter of atmosphere, of consciousness, of the spiritual dimension of being alive.
Chapter 9. A Synthesis, Hertervig, Jung, and Rothko. Thor, we've explored Hertervig's shadow work, his kinship with Van Gogh, and his spiritual atmosphere alongside Rothko. I'd love to bring all of this together. How do Hertervig, Jung, and Rothko intersect? What's the deeper synthesis?
When you place these three figures side by side, Hertervig, Jung, and Rothko, you begin to see a shared architecture. They each worked in different mediums, different centuries, different worlds. But they were all exploring the same territory, the inner landscape. Jung mapped it psychologically. Rothko mapped it emotionally. Hertervig mapped it visually through nature. Together, they form a kind of triangulation of the human soul.
Let's start with Jung. How does his psychology illuminate Hertervig and Rothko?
Jung believed that healing requires a descent, a confrontation with the shadow, the unconscious, the unintegrated parts of the self. Hertervig lived the descent. His years after Gaustad were not artistic silence. They were psychological excavation. His landscapes are the record of that journey. Rothko, in his own way, also descended. His color fields are not abstractions, they're emotional abysses. They pull you inward, toward the parts of yourself you usually avoid. Both artists embody Jung's idea that transformation begins in darkness.
And Rothko's atmosphere, how does that connect to Hertervig?
Rothko paints atmosphere as emotion. Hertervig paints atmosphere as consciousness. Jung would say both are expressions of the psyche. Rothko dissolves the world into color to reveal the emotional truth beneath it. Hertervig dissolves the world into light to reveal the psychological truth within it. Both create spaces where the viewer encounters themselves, not through narrative, but through presence.
You've used the word spiritual several times. How does spirituality tie these three together?
Jung saw spirituality not as religion, but as the process of becoming whole, individuation. Rothko saw painting as a spiritual act, a way to touch the sublime. Hertervig, though never using the language of mysticism, painted landscapes that feel like meditations. All three understood that the deepest truths are not spoken, they're feelings. Hertervig's trembling light, Rothko's vibrating color, Jung's symbolic unconscious. These are three expressions of the same inner reality.
There's profound silence in both Hertervig and Rothko.
Yes, and that silence is the bridge between them. Jung said that the unconscious speaks in symbols, not words. Hertervig's landscapes are symbolic spaces, quiet, luminous, and introspective. Rothko's canvases are silent thresholds. They don't tell you what to feel, they let you feel. Both artists create silence as a form of revelation.
And trauma as catalyst, not identity, how does that factor into this synthesis?
Jung believed that trauma cracks the ego, allowing the deeper self to emerge. Hertervig and Rothko both lived through profound psychological suffering, but neither painted their trauma directly. They painted what trauma revealed. Hertervig found light through fog. Rothko found depth through color. Jung found meaning through shadow. All three show us that suffering is not the end, it's the doorway.
So, what's the unifying insight that ties them together?
That the inner world is real, and that art is one of the most powerful ways to navigate it. Hertervig gives us the landscape. Rothko gives us the atmosphere. Jung gives us the map. Together, they teach us that healing is not about escaping the shadow, but integrating it. Not about avoiding the inner forest, but walking into it with courage. Not about silencing emotion, but listening to it. Hertervig paints the journey. Rothko paints the feeling. Jung explains the process. And when you see them together, you realize they're all describing the same human truth. That the soul becomes visible when we dare to look inward.
Chapter 10. A final reflection. Hertervig is a visionary ahead of his time. Thor, after everything we've explored, the shadow work, the psychological landscapes, the spiritual atmosphere, I want to end with a broader question. Was Lars Hertervig simply a product of his time, or was he something else entirely? Was he, in a sense, a visionary ahead of his era?
I think the evidence points overwhelmingly to the latter. Hertervig didn't just paint landscapes. He painted states of consciousness. He painted the psyche decades before psychology had a language for it. He painted atmosphere as emotion long before Rothko. He painted trauma as transformation long before Van Gogh. And he painted the shadow long before Jung articulated it. He was working in the 19th century, but his vision belongs to the 20th and even the 21st.
What makes you say that so confidently?
Because when you look at his work today, it feels contemporary. Not in style, but in spirit. His paintings resonate with modern viewers because they speak to inner life, anxiety, longing, introspection, fragmentation, and healing. These are the themes of our time. Hertervig anticipated the modern understanding that art is not just representation, it's revelation.
And yet he had no audience for this in his lifetime.
Exactly. That's the tragedy and the triumph. He was too early, too inward, too visionary. The art world of his time wanted national romanticism, heroic landscapes, academic polish. Hertervig gave them trembling light, psychological forests, and atmospheres that felt like dreams. He wasn't painting Norway. He was painting consciousness. And the world wasn't ready.
So, in a way, he lived the fate of many visionaries, misunderstood in life, recognized only later.
Yes. And that's why his story matters. Because it shows us that innovation often comes from the margins, from those who have been pushed out, silenced, or dismissed. Hertervig's isolation didn't diminish him. It distilled him. It forced him inward, where he discovered a visual language that didn't exist yet. He wasn't ahead of his time because he tried to be. He was ahead of his time because he had no choice.
And today, his work feels almost prophetic.
It does. His landscapes anticipate the psychological turn in modern art. His atmosphere anticipates abstraction. His emotional depth anticipates expressionism. His spiritual quiet anticipates minimalism. He stands at a crossroads, a 19th century painter with a 20th century soul.
If you had to summarize his legacy in one idea, what would it be?
That the inner world is real and worth painting. Hertervig showed us that the landscape of the mind is as vast, as mysterious, and as beautiful as the physical world. He turned suffering into insight, isolation into vision, and silence into light. He wasn't just a painter of nature. He was a painter of being.
That's a powerful way to end. It feels like Hertervig's story isn't just about art, it's about the human capacity to transform.
Exactly. And that's why he still matters. Because he reminds us that even in the darkest moments, there is a path inward, and sometimes that path leads to light.
Chapter 11. A final reflection. Hertervig, Jung, and the Heyoka archetype. Thor, we've explored Hertervig through so many lenses: Jung's psychology, Rothko's atmosphere, Van Gogh's emotional intensity. But there's one thread I'd love to return to as we close: the Heyoka archetype. How do Hertervig, Jung, and the Heyoka tradition come together in a final synthesis?
It's a beautiful question, because when you place these three perspectives side by side, something profound emerges. Jung gives us the map of the inner world. The Heyoka gives us the method, healing through inversion, mirroring, and paradox. And Herdervig gives us the art, the lived expression of both. Together, they form a triad of inner transformation.
Let's start with Jung. How does he anchor this synthesis?
Jung believed that every human being must confront the shadow, the unacknowledged, wounded, or repressed parts of the psyche. He saw this descent not as pathology, but as the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming whole. Herdervig lived this descent. The Heyoka embodies this descent. Jung explains it. Herdervig's years of isolation after Gaustad were not artistic silence. They were shadow work. His landscapes are the visual record of that journey.
And the Heyoka, healing through inversion? How does that archetype fit into this?
The Heyoka is the sacred mirror, the one who heals by turning the world upside down. They speak backwards, laugh when others cry, disrupt patterns to reveal truth. Their medicine is paradox. Herdervig does exactly this through his art. He paints landscapes that feel familiar yet deeply strange. He paints light that behaves like memory. He paints forests that feel like psychological thresholds. He doesn't confront the viewer, he unsettles them gently, inviting them to see themselves from a new angle. That's pure Heyoka energy, healing through inversion, revelation through quiet disruption.
So, Herdervig, who lived the archetype, becomes the bridge between Jung and Heyoka?
Exactly. He is the lived synthesis. Like Jung, he descended into the unconscious. Like Heyoka, he transformed pain into insight through inversion. And through his art, he created spaces where others could meet their own shadow. His landscapes are not just depictions of nature, they are psychological mirrors. They show us the parts of ourselves we avoid, but in a way that feels safe, luminous, and contemplative.
What unites all three of the three, Herdervig, Jung, and Heyoka, at the deepest level?
The belief that healing comes from turning inward, not outward. Jung teaches that the shadow must be faced. The Heyoka teaches that truth is revealed through inversion. Herdervig shows that this process can be made visible through trembling light, through quiet forests, through landscapes that feel like dreams. All three insist that the inner world is real, and that transformation begins when we dare to enter it.
So, in your view, Herdervig wasn't just a painter, he was a kind of Nordic Heyoka?
Yes, a quiet one, a wounded one, but a powerful one. He didn't heal through words or rituals. He healed through atmosphere, through light, through the subtle inversion of the familiar. He painted the world backwards so we could finally see it forwards. That is the essence of the Heyoka, and it is the essence of Jung's individuation, and it is the essence of Herdervig's art.
If you had to summarize this synthesis in one idea, what would it be?
That Herdervig shows us what happens when a human being walks into the shadow and returns with light. Jung gives us psychology. Heyoka gives us the archetype. Herdervig gives us the vision. He wasn't just ahead of his time. He was ahead of his culture, ahead of his language, ahead of the frameworks needed to understand him. Only now, with Jung's psychology, with the Heyoka archetype, with modern understandings of trauma and healing, can we finally see what he was doing. He wasn't painting landscapes. He was painting the soul's journey.
Chapter 12: The Gray Blue Light, Herdervig's Inner Illumination. Thor, we've talked about Herdervig's shadow work, his visionary landscapes, and the psychological depth of his art. But there's something very specific in his paintings that keeps coming up: that strange gray blue light. It's not natural sunlight. It's not moonlight. It feels otherworldly. What do you make of it?
That gray-blue light is one of the most haunting and defining elements of Herdervig's mature work. And you're right, it's not naturalistic. It doesn't behave like light from the sky. It behaves like light from the psyche. In my research study, it's described as a light that both reveals and hides, both heals and disturbs. That's exactly how it functions. It's not illumination, it's revelation
Revelation of what?
of the inner world, the emotional weather, the psychological atmosphere, the quiet turbulence beneath the surface. In Skogtjern and Gamle furutrær, the gray-blue light doesn't fall onto the landscape. It rises from within it. It clings to the trees like memory. It pools in the water like unspoken thought. It outlines forms like scars. This is not the light of nature. It's the light of consciousness.
You've said before that Hertervig paints states of mind. Does the gray-blue light reflect that?
Absolutely. The gray-blue light is the emotional texture of the painting. It's the atmosphere of introspection, the moment when the mind is neither in darkness nor in clarity, but in that liminal zone where insight begins to form. It's the light of someone who has walked through darkness and is learning to see again.
It's not comforting, though.
No, and that's important. It's not soft or romantic. It's sharp, almost intrusive. It unsettles. It challenges. It asks you to look again. That's why my research describes it as a light that lays itself over the forms like scars, like blisters, like tentacles. It's a light that reminds me of.
There's also something spiritual about it, not religious, but transcendent.
Exactly. The gray-blue light is a spiritual movement, but a quiet one. It comes from darkness, but points toward clarity. It's the light of longing, longing for release, for understanding, for inner coherence. But it's also honest enough to admit that such release may never fully come. This is why Hertervig's paintings feel so existential. They're not about nature. They're about being.
Your research also describes this light as healing, especially for people living with psychological vulnerability. How do you see that?
The healing isn't in the brightness. It's honesty. The gray-blue light doesn't hide the wound. It illuminates it gently. It says, "This is here. This is real. And it's part of you." For someone living with inner turmoil, that kind of light can be grounding. It doesn't demand change. It doesn't judge. It simply reveals, softly, steadily, truthfully. It's a light that says, "You don't have to be anything other than what you are."
So, the gray-blue light is not just a stylistic choice, it's a psychological signature?
Yes, Hertervig's inner voice made it visible. After years of silence following Gaustad, when he finally began painting again, this light appears, not as technique, but as testimony. It's the light of someone who has been in darkness and found a way to navigate it. Not escape it. Navigate it. This is why the light feels both fragile and fierce. It's the light of survival.
And what about his earlier work, like Skog from 1853? Your research describes it as a psychological forest, a place where beauty and threat coexist.
Skog is the seed of everything that comes later. The gray-blue light isn't fully formed yet, but the atmosphere is. The forest is dense, heavy, and introspective. The trees stand like silent witnesses. The light is dim but searching. It's the moment before the storm, or perhaps the moment before the awakening. Hertervig is already painting the inner landscape, even before his breakdown. Skog is the threshold. The later gray-blue light is the crossing.
So, what does the gray-blue light ultimately tell us about Hertervig?
That he wasn't painting the world as it is, he was painting the world as it feels. The gray-blue light is the emotional truth of his life. The longing, the fragility, the resilience, the quiet courage. It's the light of someone who walked through psychological darkness and returned with a new way of seeing. It's not the light of the sun. It's the light of the soul.
Chapter 13. A scene-by-scene analysis of Skogtjern and Gamle furutrær. Thor, we've talked about the gray-blue light, the psychological atmosphere, and the inner landscapes. But I'd love for us to walk through one of these paintings as if we were stepping into it, almost like a scene-by-scene analysis. Could we do that with Skogtjern or Gamle furutrær?
Absolutely. Let's start with Skogtjern, because it's one of the clearest windows into Hertervig's inner world. When you break it down scene by scene, it becomes almost like a psychological film, a slow, meditative journey into the self. The first thing you notice is the edge of the forest, not a dramatic entrance, but a quiet threshold. The trees don't invite you in, they allow you in. Their trunks stand like sentinels, tall and slightly leaning, as if they've been holding a long vigil. This is the moment Jung would call approaching the unconscious. Not yet inside, but no longer outside. The gray-blue light hovers here like a question.
The descent into stillness, and then your eye moves inward.
Exactly. The forest deepens. The light dims. The air thickens. This is where Hertervig's psychological atmosphere becomes unmistakable. The gray-blue light begins to cling to the surfaces, the bark, the moss, the water's edge, like a memory trying to take shape. Nothing is loud. Nothing is dramatic. But everything is charged. This is the descent, not into darkness, but into quiet. Then you reach the forest pond, the small forest lake. This is the heart of the painting. The water is still, but not peaceful. It's reflective but not revealing. It's a mirror that refuses to give you a clear image. This is where Hertervig's inner world becomes visible. The water doesn't show the sky. It shows depth. It shows uncertainty. It shows the unspoken. This is the Jungian shadow, not as threat, but as presence.
This is where that strange gray-blue light becomes almost physical.
Yes. The gray-blue light begins to move across the scene like a living force. It outlines the trees, softens the edges, and creates a kind of trembling atmosphere. It's not sunlight. It's not moonlight. It's the light of introspection, the illumination that comes from within. It's the moment when the painting stops being a landscape and becomes a state of mind. And then, finally, you reach the emotional core, the silent revelation. Nothing dramatic happens. No storm. No figure. No narrative. But something shifts. The painting begins to feel like it's looking back at you. This is the Heyoka moment, the inversion. The painting becomes the mirror. You become the landscape. Hertervig doesn't tell you what to feel. He lets you feel what you've been avoiding.
And what about Gamle furutrær? It feels more exposed, more vertical, more wounded.
Exactly. Gamle furutrær is the confrontation painting, the moment when the inner world stands upright and looks you in the eye. The old pine trees rise like scarred figures. Their trunks twist. Their branches reach and recoil. They are not symbols of strength. They are symbols of endurance. This is Hertervig meeting his own wound. The gray-blue light doesn't soften the trees. It clings to them like scar tissue, highlighting the cracks, the bends, the fractures. This is not romantic light. It's diagnostic light. It shows what has been broken and what has survived. The forest floor is uneven, textured, almost restless. It feels like a memory that refuses to settle. The ground is not stable, it's alive with old stories. This is Hertervig's past, painted into the soil. The trees stretch upward, but not gracefully. Their ascent is strained, almost painful. This is the psychological struggle to rise despite everything pulling you down. It's the visual form of resilience. And yet, despite the wounds, despite the tension, the trees stand. They endure. They hold their place in the world. This is Hertervig's quiet triumph, not victory, but persistence.
So, Skogtjern is the final descent, and Gamle furutrær is the final confrontation?
Exactly. Together, they form a psychological diptych. Skogtjern, entering the inner world. Gamle furutrær, meeting what lives there. Both illuminated by the same gray-blue light, the light of introspection, of survival, of truth. Hertervig wasn't painting landscapes. He was painting the stages of becoming.
Chapter 14. A scene-by-scene analysis of Fra Tysvær. Or, we've walked through Skogtjern and Gamle furutrær like psychological films, the descent and the confrontation. But Fra Tysvær feels different. It feels like a return. Could we break that painting down scene by scene as well?
Absolutely. Fra Tysvær is the third movement in Hertervig's Inner Symphony. If Skogtjern is the descent into the unconscious, and Gamle furutrær is the confrontation with the wound, then Fra Tysvær is the emergence, the moment when the inner world opens again, not in triumph, but in clarity. Let's walk through it. The first thing you notice in Fra Tysvær is the expansion. Unlike the dense forests of Skogtjern, here the landscape opens. The horizon stretches. The air feels lighter. The composition breathes. This is the psychological shift, the moment after the storm when the mind begins to reorganize itself. It's not joy. It's not relief. It's space. A space that wasn't available before.
And the light feels different too.
Yes, profoundly different. The gray-blue light is still present, but it's softened. It no longer clings like scar tissue. It floats. It illuminates without accusation. It's the same inner light, but now it's integrated. This is the light of someone who has made peace with their shadow, not defeated it, not escaped it, integrated it. Then your eye moves across the terrain, the gentle slopes, the water, the distant hills. This is not a literal depiction of Tysvær. It's a memory landscape, a reconstruction of home filtered through introspection. Hertervig isn't painting where he is. He's painting where he returns to, internally. This is the psychological homecoming.
The water in this painting feels calmer than in Skogtjern.
Exactly. In Skogtjern, the water is a mirror of uncertainty. In Fra Tysvær, the water is a pulse, steady, rhythmic, almost meditative. It reflects not confusion, but coherence. This is the moment when the inner world stops resisting itself. Water becomes a symbol of emotional continuity, the ability to feel without drowning. Look at the trees in Fra Tysvær. They're not twisted like in Gamle furutrær. They're not looming like in Skogtjern. They stand with a quiet dignity, as if witnessing the landscape rather than dominating it. These trees are not wounds. They're companions. They represent the parts of the self that survive the journey intact.
And then there's the horizon. It feels almost symbolic.
It is symbolic. The horizon in Fra Tysvær is not distant or unreachable. It's gentle, approachable, almost tender. It suggests possibilities not grand, heroic possibilities, but human possibilities. The possibility of living with one's inner world rather than fighting it. This is the psychological resolution, not a cure, not a victory, but a new orientation.
So if Skogtjern is the descent and Gamle furutrær is the confrontation, Fra Tysvær is the return?
Exactly. It's the return to the self, the moment when the inner landscape becomes livable again. The gray-blue light is still there, but now it guides rather than unsettles. The forms are still charged, but now they harmonize rather than clash. Fra Tysvær is the painting of someone who has walked through darkness and found a way to inhabit the world again. Not as they were, but as they have become.
So, Fra Tysvær is not nostalgia, it's integration.
Yes, it's the visual form of psychological healing, not the erasure of pain, but the weaving of pain into meaning. It's the moment when the inner world and the outer world begin to speak the same language. Hertervig wasn't painting a place. He was painting a state of being. And Fra Tysvær is the state of being that emerges after the shadow has been faced, after the wound has been acknowledged, after the inner light has been reclaimed. It's the painting of a man who found his way home, not geographically, but spiritually.
Chapter 15. Hertervig's gray-blue light and Turner's atmospheric light. We've spent a lot of time inside Hertervig's inner landscapes, the gray-blue light, the trembling atmosphere, the psychological depth. But there's another giant in art history who was obsessed with light, J.M.W. Turner. How do you see Hertervig's light in relation to Turner's?
It's a fascinating comparison because, on the surface, Turner and Hertervig seem like opposites. Turner is fire. Hertervig is mist. Turner dissolves the world in radiance. Hertervig dissolves it in introspection. But when you look deeper, both artists use light not as a physical phenomenon, but as a metaphysical language. Turner paints the sublime, the overwhelming force of nature. Hertervig paints the subtle, the quiet force of the psyche. Yet both are painting something beyond the visible.
Let's start with Turner. What defines his light?
Turner's light is elemental. It's volcanic, oceanic, and atmospheric. It consumes the canvas. In his late works, the sun doesn't illuminate the world. It devours it. His yellows, golds, and whites are not descriptive. They're existential. They express awe, terror, and transcendence. Turner's light is the world on fire. It's the light of revelation through intensity.
And Hertervig's light?
Hertervig's gray-blue light is the opposite pole. It doesn't overwhelm, it infiltrates. It doesn't blaze, it lingers. It doesn't dominate the landscape, it haunts it. Where Turner's light expands outward, Hertervig's light collapses inward. Turner gives us the cosmos. Hertervig gives us consciousness. His gray-blue light is the illumination of introspection, the light that appears when the mind turns toward itself.
So, despite the differences, they're both trying to reveal something?
Exactly. Turner reveals infiniteness, terror, the beauty of existence. Hertervig reveals the intimate, the fragility, the longing, the unresolved tension of the inner world. Turner's light says, "Look at the immensity of the universe." Hertervig's light says, "Look at the immensity within himself." Both lights are spiritual, but in different registers.
Turner's paintings often feel like they're dissolving. How does that compare to Hertervig?
Turner dissolves form into atmosphere. Ships, coastlines, mountains melt into light. It's as if the world is being unmade before his eyes. This dissolution is cosmic, almost apocalyptic. Hertervig dissolves form into emotion. Trees, water, cliffs soften into psychological presence. His dissolution is not cosmic. It's introspective. It's the world seen through memory, vulnerability, and inner weather. Turner dissolves the world into light. Hertervig dissolves the world into feeling.
You've described Hertervig's light as inner weather. Could Turner's light be seen the same way?
Turner's light is more like outer weather, storms, sunsets, fog, fire. It's the drama of nature. Hertervig's gray-blue light is the drama of the psyche. It's the light of someone who has walked through psychological darkness and found a way to illuminate it without erasing it. Turner's atmosphere is meteorological. Hertervig's atmosphere is psychological.
And emotionally? How do their lights feel?
Turner's light is hot, even when it's foggy. It vibrates with energy, urgency, transcendence. It's the light of revelation through intensity. Hertervig's light is cool, even when it's bright. It vibrates with vulnerability, introspection, and quiet resilience. It's the light of revelation through honesty. Turner's light overwhelms. Hertervig's light understands.
So, what does this comparison ultimately tell us?
Both artists were reaching for the same thing, the invisible, but from opposite directions. Turner reaches outward, toward the sublime. Hertervig reaches inward, toward the soul. Turner's atmospheric light is the world exploding into meaning. Hertervig's gray-blue light is the self unfolding into truth. Both lights are spiritual. Both lights are transformative. Both lights are visionary. But Hertervig's light is the one that whispers. You can walk through your own darkness and still find a way to see.
Chapter 16. Hertervig and Caspar David Friedrich, two mystics of the northern landscape. We've compared Hertervig to Turner, to Rothko, even to Van Gogh. But there's another artist whose work seems to resonate deeply with Hertervig's, Caspar David Friedrich. Both painted landscapes that feel spiritual, introspective, even metaphysical. How do you see the connection between them?
It's a beautiful comparison because Friedrich and Hertervig share a kind of spiritual kinship. even though they never met, never influenced each other directly, and lived in different artistic worlds. Friedrich is the great prophet of Romanticism. Hertervig is the quiet mystic of Norwegian introspection. But both understood that nature is not scenery. It's a mirror. Friedrich paints the soul facing the infinite. Hertervig paints the soul facing itself.
Friedrich's landscapes often feel like stages for inner drama. Does Hertervig do something similar?
Absolutely, but with a different emotional register. Friedrich's landscapes are theatrical, symbolic, almost liturgical. Think of Wanderer above the sea of fog or Monk by the sea. The human figure stands before the vastness of creation, dwarfed by the sublime. Herdervig removes the figure entirely and makes the landscape itself the psyche. Friedrich externalizes the spiritual struggle. Herdervig internalizes it. Both are painting the inner world, but Friedrich uses the human silhouette as a mediator, while Herdervig lets the trees, water, and light speak directly.
Both artists seem obsessed with solitude.
Yes, but solitude means something different for each of them. For Friedrich, solitude is a spiritual posture. It's the moment when the soul stands before God, nature, and eternity. His figures are contemplative pilgrims. For Herdervig, solitude is psychological necessity. It's the space where the wounded self can breathe, reflect, and slowly reconstruct itself. His landscapes are not pilgrimages, they're sanctuaries. Friedrich's solitude is chosen. Herdervig's solitude is endured and then transformed.
And what about light? Friedrich's light is often golden, sacred, almost biblical. Herdervig's is gray-blue, introspective, trembling. How do these two lights relate?
Friedrich's light is transcendent. It pours from the horizon like revelation. It's the light of faith, of hope, of divine presence. His skies are sermons. Herdervig's light is immanence. It rises from within the landscape, from within the psyche. It's the light of introspection, of vulnerability, of emotional truth. Friedrich's light descends from heaven. Herdervig's light emerges from the soul. Both lights are spiritual, but one is vertical, the other horizontal.
Friedrich's nature is symbolic, crosses, ruins, fog, mountains. Herdervig's nature feels more lived, more intimate.
Exactly. Friedrich uses nature as metaphor. A dead tree becomes mortality. A ruined abbey becomes the fall of faith. A sunrise becomes resurrection. Herdervig uses nature as memory. A pine tree becomes endurance. A lake becomes introspection. A gray-blue haze becomes emotional weather. Friedrich's landscapes are allegories. Herdervig's landscapes are confessions.
Friedrich's paintings often feel solemn, even mournful. Herdervig's feel fragile, trembling, quietly alive.
Yes, Friedrich's emotional temperature is sacred melancholy. His landscapes are cathedrals of silence. They carry the weight of eternity. Herdervig's emotional temperature is tender vulnerability. His landscapes are rooms of introspection. They carry the weight of survival. Friedrich paints the soul before the infinite. Herdervig paints the soul before itself.
So, both artists are spiritual, but in different ways?
Precisely. Friedrich's spirituality is cosmic, the human being confronting the vastness of creation. Herdervig's spirituality is intimate, the human being confronting the vastness within. Friedrich asks, "What is my place in the universe?" Herdervig asks, "What is my place in myself?" Both questions are profound. Both lead to transformation.
So, what does this comparison ultimately reveal about Herdervig?
That he belongs to a lineage of artists who use landscape as a spiritual language, but he speaks in a uniquely quiet dialect. Friedrich gives us the grand metaphysics of Romanticism. Herdervig gives us the subtle metaphysics of introspection. Friedrich paints the divine in nature. Herdervig paints the human in nature. And in that difference lies Herdervig's genius. He doesn't show us the world as it is. He shows us the world as it feels, fragile, luminous, wounded, and alive. He is not Friedrich's successor. He is Friedrich's echo, softer, more vulnerable, more inward. but just as profound.
Chapter 17. Hertervig and August Capellan, Two Souls in the Northern Forest. Thor, we've compared Hertervig to Friedrich, Turner, Rothko. But there's one comparison that feels especially intimate, almost like two branches from the same tree. Hertervig and August Capellan. Both were Norwegian, both painted forests, both carried a kind of inner heaviness. How do you see the relationship between them?
It's a powerful pairing because Capellan and Hertervig share something that goes beyond style or geography. They share a temperament, a sensitivity, a way of seeing the forest not as scenery, but as a psychological and existential space. Capellan paints the melancholy of nature. Hertervig paints the melancholy within nature. It's a subtle difference, but it changes everything.
Capellan's forests feel heavy, almost funereal. Hertervig's feel wounded, trembling. What's happening there?
Capellan's forests are monuments of sorrow. His trees stand like ancient ruins, dark, massive, decaying. They carry the weight of time, of mortality, of the romantic idea that nature reflects the tragic condition of humanity. Hertervig's forests are creatures of vulnerability. His trees lean, twist, shimmer. They're not ruins, they're survivors. They carry the weight of personal experience, not cosmic tragedy. Capellan paints the forest as fate. Hertervig paints the forest as feeling.
And the light, Capellan's is dark, earthy, almost suffocating. Hertervig's is that strange gray-blue glow. How do these lights differ?
Capellan's light is subdued, almost swallowed by the forest. It's the light of resignation, of inevitability. It doesn't illuminate, it mourns. Hertervig's gray-blue light is restless, searching, introspective. It doesn't mourn, it questions. It reveals the inner world, not the outer decay. Capellan's light says, "This is the end of something." Hertervig's light says, "This is the beginning of understanding."
Capellan feels colder, more fatalistic. Hertervig feels fragile, but alive.
Exactly. Capellan's emotional temperature is stoic melancholy, a kind of noble sadness. His forests are dignified in their decay. Hertervig's emotional temperature is trembling vulnerability, a kind of raw openness. His landscapes are not dignified, they're exposed. Capellan accepts the darkness. Hertervig negotiates with it.
Capellan died young, at 25. Hertervig lived long but struggled with mental illness and social isolation. Do their inner lives shape their art?
Profoundly. Capellan's early death gives his work a sense of tragic finality, as if he knew time was short. His forests feel like elegies. Hertervig's long struggle gives his work a sense of ongoing survival, as if he kept painting to stay connected to himself. His forests feel like diaries. Capellan paints the forest as a destiny. Hertervig paints the forest as a process.
So, does Capellan use nature as a mirror, while Hertervig uses it as a mind?
Beautifully put. Capellan's landscapes mirror the romantic belief that nature reflects human emotion, sorrow, longing, mortality. Hertervig's landscapes are emotional. They don't reflect the psyche, they embody it. The forest is not a symbol, it's a psychological space. Capellan, nature as metaphor. Hertervig, nature as consciousness.
Friedrich influenced Capellan, but Hertervig feels more solitary, more inward.
Yes. Capellan inherits Friedrich's spiritual melancholy, the sense of standing before something larger than oneself. His forests are cathedrals. Hertervig inherits no tradition. His spirituality is improvised, personal, and intuitive. His forests are not cathedrals, they're sanctuaries. Capellan paints the divine in decay. Hertervig paints the human in survival.
So, what does this comparison ultimately reveal about Hertervig?
That he took the romantic forest and turned it inside out. Capellan gave us the forest as tragedy. Hertervig gave us the forest as therapy. Capellan painted the end of something. Hertervig painted the beginning of something. Capellan shows us the forest as fate. Hertervig shows us the forest as healing. Both are profound. Both are necessary. But Hertervig's vision is the one that continues to open inward, outward, and forward.
Chapter 18. A final reflection. Hertervig and the mission of this channel. Thor, we've brought Hertervig into conversation with Jung, with Rothko, with the Heyoka archetype. But I want to end on something more personal. My channel is dedicated to exploring psychological concepts through art. How does Hertervig's story connect to your own mission here?
In many ways, Hertervig is the mission of this channel. Not because he's Norwegian, or because he's a landscape painter, but because his life embodies the very intersection I'm trying to illuminate, the meeting point between psychology, creativity, and the inner world. Hertervig shows us that art is not decoration, it's navigation, it's survival, it's a map of the psyche. And that's exactly what I want this channel to explore. How art becomes a language for the things we cannot say, the wounds we carry, the transformations we undergo.
So, Hertervig becomes more than a historical figure, he becomes a kind of guide?
Yes, a guide, a mirror, a companion in the inner landscape. Jung gives us theory. Heyoka gives us the archetype. But Hertervig gives us the lived example, the human being who walked through psychological darkness and returned with light. That's the essence of what I want to share here, that art can reveal the inner world, that psychology can help us understand it, and that together they can help us heal.
In your own background, mathematical modeling, physical modeling, software development, how does it fit into this?
It fits more naturally than people might think. Modeling is about understanding systems, how forces interact, how structures hold, and how patterns emerge. When I turned toward psychology and art, I realized I was still modeling, but now the system was the human mind. Hertervig's landscapes are psychological models. Jung's archetypes are symbolic models. The Heyoka is an energetic model of inversion and healing. My mission is to translate these models into something accessible, something people can feel, understand, and use.
So, has your channel become a kind of bridge?
Exactly. A bridge between disciplines, between eras, between ways of knowing. Hertervig painted the inner landscape. Jung mapped it. The Heyoka archetype animates it. And my role, humbly, is to help people see how these threads connect and how they can illuminate our own inner journeys.
That's a powerful mission, and it feels deeply aligned with Hertervig's legacy.
It does. Because Hertervig reminds us that the inner world is not abstract, it's real, it's textured, it's luminous. He shows us that even in isolation, even in confusion, even in pain, there is a path inward that leads to meaning. And that's what I want this channel to be. A place where art becomes a mirror, where psychology becomes a compass, and where people can explore their own inner landscapes with curiosity and courage.
So, in a way, Hertervig isn't just a subject of your videos, he's a symbol of what your channel stands for.
Yes. He is the quiet reminder that the deepest truths are often found in the places we least expect, in silence, in shadow, in the trembling light between the trees. And if this channel can help even one person see their inner world with more clarity, more compassion, more courage, then I think Hertervig would approve.